Well, I think first and foremost is to think about national narratives. So, what is it that is specifically happening in each country? What are the sort of contexts of production? What are the definitions of art specifically? And this is certainly an answer to globally talking about how do we define beyond a sort of narrative that's usually defined by the West in other contexts. And the thing that's super interesting about state socialism is that the definition of art is so different than it is in a post-war West. So in state socialism, art is really defined as part of national identity, as part of national culture. And even if an experimental artist, for example, diverges from that identification, she's still been raised or educated or whatever, been around that kind of definition and that value that's been placed on art, which would certainly define how her experimental practice is going to be shaped. First, I would say that feminism and experimental practice really is a very rich way of starting to redefine what feminist art history looks like. So in the East Bloc context, there's a lot of discussion about this. And East Germany, certainly, there are art historians working on this as well. But there's still a lot to be done in terms of redefining or defining what feminism meant in these experimental practices. And more generally, I think the representation of work and labor and the working class in state socialist practices and how that then also informs a lot of experimental practice in what I know most about is the 1980s is a super interesting way of seeing how art responds to a national culture, to the priorities of a national culture, and showing also how experimentations with representations of work and labor demonstrate sort of the failures of a state socialist project. Looking really specifically at how both state and experimental practice is responding to Germany's cultural history. So not looking at 1933 or 1945 as breaking points, but as continuations. So seeing how East Germany revives some questions of socially minded practice, whether that be in the photo essay or in conceptual performance art in the 1980s. Another point of origin is certainly this different definition of what art and culture is meant to be in a state socialist context. So really responding to the national framework, the national value that is placed on art and culture. The fact that so many artists worked interdisciplinarily, so across media, and not necessarily always just to be exploring what a medium or what other media are allowing you to do with your artistic practice, but as a pragmatic response to living in a situation of material privation, working under a context where the national aesthetic is really divided by genre and trying to resist that. I definitely think global is a preferential term to international because international implies some sort of contact and exchange. So, which just didn't happen as much in East Germany as it did in other Eastern Bloc countries. And also the global term defines really clearly how state socialist artists, so official artists, and experimental artists were quite invested in being a part of a global conversation for very different reasons. But also, I really think that the framing, especially in East Germany, is really local. So I think that artists were really responding to what kind of innovations had happened in East Germany, especially among innovations in experimental culture. So how had somebody in the 1970s pushed against the state's schematic and ruling of culture, and how that led up to the possibilities in the 1980s for autonomous galleries or Samistat literatures or performance art. I definitely think that understanding the context is really important. Every place has its own national narrative and historical narrative, and in East Germany, it's no different than in the United States. So you just get a better sense of how an artist is responding to her context when you have a little bit of understanding of that political or economic or social context. And that really relates to a general definition that I ascribe to, which is that art and visual culture are not only a lens, but a driver of social and political change. And being able to understand that beyond, especially beyond a sort of traditional art historical narrative, in a context that's very different, like East Germany, requires some sensitivity to that particular political situation.